Hello YouTube. I'll tell you today about some very unusual experiments in a field of science that I am sure will have future. But today we'll talk about the past, because this past itself has still unsolved mysteries and a number of secrets. Vladimir Mikhailovich Bekhterev was the founder of Russian experimental psychology, neuropathologist and psychiatrist, a gifted person and a true scientist. He founded a new neuropsychiatric institute, described a spinal lesion known as the Bekhterev disease as well. He gained the fame of the so-called first after God. As one German scientist said, only two people know the structure of the human brain, God and Bekhterev. Doctors read his bestseller, Secrets of the Brain, Hypnosis and Suggestion. In it, Bekhterev explained the cases of mass hallucinations and his own experiments on the transmission of thoughts at a distance. He also insisted that in addition to physical infection, there is also a mental infection. Its germs are transmitted through gestures, words, and especially widely through newspapers. He wasn't privy yet to Facebook and other new inventions of, I should say, our time. As a neurophysiologist, Vladimir Bekhterev authoritatively stated, fanaticism dilutes the brain. He was highly appreciated both in Tsarist Russia before the revolution and under the Soviet regime. He was even called for consultations with sick Vladimir Lenin, and on the eve of his death, Bekhterev advised Stalin, and we'll get to it later. Bekhterev became interested in the mysteries of thought transmission over a distance, telepathy, at the very beginning of the 20th century. At that time, he had been the director of the Clinic of Mental and Nervous Diseases of the Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg for about 10 years. In the summer of 1904, his short article titled Mental Suggestion or Focus appeared in the 8th issue of the magazine or journal Review of Psychiatry, Neurology and Experimental Psychology. In it in particular, it was about the unusual experiences of the Dr. Kotik with a 14-year-old girl, Sofia Starker, who performed with her father in one of the Odessa entertainment booths, like Coney Island type. Dr. Kotik was an ardent supporter of mental suggestion, unconditionally recognized the existence of telepathy, and was the author of books on this topic. He explained the nature of telepathic transmission by the action of some mysterious N rays emitted by nervous tissue, especially the brain. There was a lot of talk about this phenomena at that time. Dr. Kotik himself conducted research on mental suggestion, and the results of his experiments were quite impressive. At first glance, Starker's performance were a long-known circus mnemonics trick. The audience gave Sophia's father various small objects, and she, sitting blindfolded in the distance, guessed which object was given to her. Well, it was given. Usually in such performances, a conditional agent or cipher, a key hidden in questions, voice, intonations, and other audio signals is used to prompt. But that's the catch, that Sofia Starker's father did not address her with any questions, did not give any remarks. Dr. Kotik conducted special tests with Sophia and was convinced, or so he thought, that the point here is not in mnemonics, but in the actual mind reading. Dr. Kotik's research on the Starker phenomenon seemed to be worthy of attention to Bekhterev. He recalled how, abroad in Vienna, he himself had observed a similar demonstration of mental suggestion on the stage. According to the general formulation of the case with guessing of thoughts, Bekhterev wrote in his article, there was obviously a lot of similarity with how Sophia Starker did her experiments. I found absolutely nothing in them that could be recognized as deception or trick. Even without conducting experiments on telepathy himself, Bekhterev closely followed the work in this area of his colleagues, foreign and Russian. He highly appreciated the experiments of the most prominent French physiologist, Charles Richer, who was the first to use mathematical methods to evaluate mental suggestion. He noted interesting experiments of the Russian doctor Hovrin with a girl who had the ability to read letters in sealed envelopes. Alas, the fact of the existence of telepathy was still not fully revealed. Bekhterev confidence that mental suggestion does not contradict the basic scientific views at all, according to him, later was replaced by doubts. But if experiments with humans did not lead to a positive solution to the issue, then is it possible to solve this issue with the help of experiments on animals? Here is what seemingly strange paradoxical thought the academician expressed. This was his idea. He had reasons for this. Indeed, animals are easier to hypnotize, and in this state, as it was believed, telepathic abilities are enhanced. Animals can be forced into unquestioning obedience by training. This is very favorable, wrote Bekhterev, for staging such experiments. Finally, and most importantly, the animals are freed from any suspicion of involving the experiments in deception. Given these circumstances, Bekhterev came to the conclusion that telepathic experiments on animals, for example dogs, should be given unconditional preferences over experiments on humans. And he had been looking for a long time for an opportunity to put his ideas into practice. The opportunity presented itself only in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. That day, Vladimir Bekhterev was at a performance at the Modern Circus in the city at that time called Petrograd. It was still St. Petersburg. At that time it was called Petrograd. The famous trainer Vladimir Leonidovich Durov was performing. In particular, he demonstrated a dog, a mathematician from the breed of Saint Bernards named Lord. The dog could count. Durov offered the audience to name any two numbers, but with the condition that their sum did not exceed 9. Then, allegedly, on the mental suggestion of the trainer, the dog barked the sum in terms, the number that this has been done several times, and the Saint Bernard had never made a mistake. There was no one among the audience who watched Durov's performance with more interest and attention than Bekhterev. During the intermission, Durov approached the scientist. It turned out that he too has been harboring the idea of telepathic experiments on dogs for a long time. So they decided to do this together, and in order not to delay the matter, to conduct the first experiments right at that time at Bekhterov's apartment. Bekhterev lived on Botkinskaya Street number 9 in an apartment located in the building of the Clinic of Mental and Nervous Diseases. On the appointed day, Durov brought 2 dogs to him, a huge Saint Bernard, we know that the name was Lord, and a small, lively fox terrier called Picky. They started with the Lord, the dog named Lord. The dog was seated on the sofa, having written down the number on a piece of paper. Durov, turning his back to the dog, began to mentally inspire the dog how many times it was necessary to bark. Then he commanded loudly, "Lord, count," and the Saint Bernard barked exactly as many times as required, according to the task. The experiment was repeated over and over again, and always with the same success. After lunch, experiments invented by Bekhterev himself with the fox terrier Picky began right in the dining room. The task of the first experiment was, Bekhterev said, for Picky to run up to the dining table, which had not yet been cleaned, and grabbed with its teeth one particular napkin lying near its edge, which otherwise did not stand out from a number of others lying on the same table. Durov sat Picky on a chair and, holding the dog's head with both hands, began to stare intently into the dog's eyes. The mental suggestion lasted about 30 minutes. After that, Picky was released. A little nimble dog, Bekhterev recalled, rushes headlong to the table, grabs the agreed-upon napkin with its teeth, and solemnly carries it to the experimenter. On the second task, Picky took a book from the bookcase and brought it. The third, also proposed by Bekhterev, was of a musical nature. According to him, Picky was required to jump on a round stool in front of the piano and then hit the keys on the right side of the keyboard with its paw. And the fox terrier performed this task flawlessly. But perhaps the most curious and difficult was the last experience. The dog had to jump up on one of the chairs that stood against the wall, then jump to the next table, and standing on its hind legs, scratch a large portrait hanging above the table. Bekhterev could not hide his admiration when the fox terrier coped with this difficult task quite brilliantly. Later, Bekhterev admitted that, fearing hints to the dog, he closely watched both Durov himself and Picky, but could not notice anything suspicious. And the tasks were born right there, impromptu. Unfortunately, the next day Durov had to leave Petrograd. His tour was over. Saying goodbye, they agreed to continue the experiments in the future. However, the war and the revolution destroyed these plans. The cooperation on Bekhterev and Durov was interrupted for a long time. They met again only in 1919, but not in Petrograd, in Moscow, in the laboratory of zoopsychology of Vladimir Durov on the old Bozhedomka area. This was an original laboratory, a reflex factory, as Durov called it. Experiments related to the study of the psyche of animals were conducted at that place. Famous scientists such as Professor of Physiology Leontovich, Professor of Zoology Kozhevnikov, founder of heliobiology Chizhevsky took part in them. Please see my video, Warnings from the Sun, about Chizhevsky, a very unusual Russian scientist. And what he was warning about, I think we can see now happening, and at other periods of our history once the sun was acting up. Anyway, let's get back to the animals. Bekhterev did not find the Saint Bernard Lord alive anymore because the nice dog died from an accident. But Picky was still in perfect health. It was with this dog that they managed to make new experiments in telepathy. This time, Bekhterev decided to experiment as much as possible on his own, and even in the absence of Durov. The tasks for the dog resemble those given to it in St. Petersburg or Petrograd, but there were also innovations in the method of experiments. For example, mental suggestion was carried out with different facial expressions of the suggester. They worked blindfolded. It turned out that all this does not affect the results at all. The dog, wrote Bekhterev, steadily performed the tasks assigned to it. The scientists reported on experiments of mental influence on animals in the autumn of 1919 at a conference at the Institute for the Study of the Brain and Mental Activity, which he founded in Petrograd. He stated that such experiments open up new opportunities in the study of the issue of mental suggestion in a laboratory way method. He spoke about this even more confidently in reports at conferences of his institute in February and March of 1920. By that time, a whole group of scientists at the institute, including a psychologist, a hypnologist, a physiologist, a physicist, and even a philosopher, had already participated in the research of telepathy. Psychiatrists Karmanov, Perepel, Flexer, Ivanov, Smolensky traveled to Moscow, to Durov's laboratory, and conducted experiments according to the plan outlined by Bekhterev. Mental suggestion was now most often performed by the researchers themselves, while Durov was in another room. They tried to use screens that covered the suggester, like the inductor. They did not have a noticeable effect on the course of the experiments, neither wooden nor metal nor paraffin nor cotton screens. Such an experiment was also carried out. Loud sounds were drowned out by breathing noises and the heartbeat of the inductor. What they thought is that suddenly this noise suggested something to the dog. No, and this did not prevent the animal from correctly and accurately perceiving the mentally sent suggestion or order to him. Bekhterev also visited Moscow from time to time. In the early 1920s, the French bulldog Daisy and the German shepherd Mars served as his experimental dogs. Daisy, like the late Lord, was a talented counter. That's the term used for experimental dogs. With Daisy, experiments of mental suggestion were possible even from the next room with the doors tightly closed. Mars coped with tasks no less difficult than those that the fox terrier Picky managed to perform. But what was the procedure of mental suggestion? What did the suggester himself feel at that moment? Well, Vladimir Durov spoke about this as follows. When I inspire, I look into the eyes of a dog, or better to say, into the depths of its eyes. Beyond the eyes, I mentally penetrate, as it were, into the very brain of the animal and imagine, for example, not the word go, but the necessary motor action by which the dog must perform a mental task. At the same time, I vividly imagine the path that the dog should follow, as if imprinting in my and its brain the distinctive signs on this path, like a crack, a spot, a random thing. Finally, the place where the intended object is located, and especially the object itself with its features, shape, position, color. Only now I give a mental order, like a push to the dog's brain, go, and I will step aside, opening the way for the dog to execute the order. Bekhterev believed that the basis of mental suggestion is nervous current, radiant energy, and shared the views of the famous Moscow engineer Kaczynski, who put forward the electromagnetic hypothesis of thought transmission over a distance. There is a reason to believe, wrote Bekhterev, that here we are dealing with manifestation of electromagnetic energy, and most likely with the Hertz rays. In order to test his hypothesis, a cabin upholstered in sheet iron and covered with a metal mesh, the so-called Faraday chamber, was built in the zoopsychology laboratory. Mental suggestion to the dog was carried out from this chamber, the walls of which were supposed to delay the electromagnetic nerve current. The author of the hypothesis about the so-called brain radio, Bernard Kaczynski, also took part in the experiments. The process turned out to be extremely complicated. It was not possible to get a firm answer to the question about the nature, about the reality of mental suggestion. And this is not surprising. Even in our time, a century later, this answer is still not found. In the summer of 1920, Bekhterev again made a report about telepathy. He announced that he had conducted successful experiments on people with the transmission of thought over a distance. Especially interesting were the experiments with an 18-year-old girl who was unusually impressionable. Almost without difficulty, she was able to guess which object was intended by the inductor. The objects were laid out on the table in front of the subject, the most ordinary things: a toothbrush, an inkwell, a key, a comb, a match, and the like. Bekhterev sat behind an opaque screen or behind a metal screen. He was handed a hat with folded pieces of paper on which the names of objects lying on the table were written. Bekhterev took one of the notes at random, unfolded it, and silently reading the inscription, began a mental suggestion. The results were amazing. Of the 17 experiments, only 2 were unsuccessful. In other cases, the subject chose exactly the object, the image of which was mentally transmitted to her. Of course, from the modern point of view, Bekhterev can be blamed for the lack of rigor of the statement of experience, but it was, one might say, at the dawn of scientific parapsychology, when research methods were just beginning to be developed. No criticism about the pseudo-mediated transmission of thoughts, as one of the opponents put it, could force Bekhterev to stop research on telepathy with people and animals. It is known that in 1926, 1 year before his sudden and mysterious death, Bekhterev visited Durov's laboratory again and conducted telepathic experiments with the shepherd Mars there. After the death of the great scientist, Durov continued experiments of mental suggestion on animals alone. In total, more than 10,000 such experiments were carried out, together with Bekhterev and without him. Well, they ended with the death of Vladimir Durov in 1934. Those amazing, unique experiences and experiments. The circumstances of Bekhtérev's sudden death caused a lot of rumors and legends. Let me tell you some of them. On January 20, 1927, Vladimir Mikhailovich Bekhterev, the founder of the Russian experimental psychology, neuropathologist and psychiatrist, turned 70 years old. And at the end of 1927, on December 24, the scientist died. It would seem that there is nothing surprising about the death of a 70-year-old man. But not in the case of Bekhterev. There were legends in medical circles about the incredible vital energy and efficiency of the academician. In addition, in the same 1927, he married for the second time a woman with whom he had been close for 10 years, Berta Gurji. The circumstances of the sudden death of the world-renowned scientist have not yet been definitely clarified, which gives grounds for a variety of assumptions. So there are several ideas of the mysterious death of Bekhterev. The last day of the scientist's life is known from the memoirs of contemporaries. On December 23, 1947, in the morning, Bekhterev went to the Kremlin Medical and Sanitary Department to consult one of the Soviet leaders at the time, Joseph Stalin. From there, he went to a meeting at the Congress of Neuropathologists and Psychiatrists at the Institute of Psychoprophylaxis of the People's Commissariat of Health of the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic. That's how they referred to ministries at that time, like the departments. commissariat. Then there was a tour of the institute. Bekhterev inspected the laboratory with the latest equipment. The traditional tea party and conversation with colleagues were interrupted by Bekhterov's young wife, Berta, who, according to eyewitnesses, loudly and importunately asked to end the discussion because she and her husband were late for the theater. At the Bolshoi Theater, Bekhterev and his wife watched the Swan Lake Ballet performance. In the food shop during the intermission, the scientist ate 2 portions of ice cream. After that, he became ill. And from the second act, the Bekhterevs returned to the apartment of Professor Blagovolin, with whom they stayed in Moscow. A doctor was invited to give Bekhterev injections, and by the morning of December 24, Vladimir Mikhailovich Bekhterev died. The official explanation of the scientist's death was paralysis of the heart due to a short-term attack of intestinal disorder, the cause of which was food poisoning. The autopsy of Bekhtérev's body was carried out hastily on the day of his death. Moreover, this procedure was done not by a professional pathologist, but by a Moscow student of the deceased academician. The autopsy took place right in Professor Blagovolin's apartment and consisted in extracting the scientist's brain, which was examined and sent to the Leningrad Institute where Bekhterev worked. And the academician's body was cremated on the same day. In the morning of the next day, rumors about the mysterious death of academician Bekhterev began to spread around Moscow, where neuropathologists, psychiatrists, and psychologists who had come to the Congress from all over the country stayed at that time. The most common explanation of Bekhtérev's death is that the scientist was deliberately poisoned by the NKVD, the secret police, precursors of the KGB, after he diagnosed Joseph Stalin with about his mental health. In December 1927, again, Bekhterev, going from Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was called by that time, to Moscow for the Congress of Psychiatrists, Bekhterev received a telegram from the Kremlin administration asking for a consultation of one of the leaders of the Soviet state. So on December 22nd, about that, he consulted Joseph Stalin as a neurologist about his medical condition. Stalin was found to be without the use of one arm, having a withered arm. Okay? But the psychiatrists could not help noticing the personality traits of the future leader of the Soviet people. According to the memoirs of contemporaries, after leaving Stalin's office, Bekhterev allegedly uttered a short phrase, "ordinary paranoid," which was immediately heard and picked up by the people in that room. According to other sources, academician Bekhterev, having been late for the scientific congress, answered the question of colleague for the reasons for the delay. Here's what he said: "I watched one paranoid without the use of one arm, and he had a withered arm." Perhaps this statement was passed on to Stalin. I don't even think perhaps should come into play here. Definitely somebody informed. One way or another, but by the evening of that day, Bekhtérev's fate was sealed. Well, in 1927, Soviet leader Grigory Zinoviev, who was at the head of the Leningrad Communist Party organization, entered into a deadly battle with Stalin for power. Spiders were fighting each other, so to say, inside the can. Zinoviev hoped to defeat Stalin with the help of Bekhtérev's testimony. The main ace card, so to say, or trump card of the Leningrad party was the accusation of his opponent in poisoning Lenin. So they wanted to say that Stalin murdered Lenin. Bekhterev in 1923 examined that patient Vladimir Lenin, the first Soviet leader, one of the originators of the communist revolution. The word of a scientist with a worldwide reputation and authority could destroy Stalin as a political force. But the scientist's conclusions were not what Zinoviev expected. They destroyed the myth of the greatness of the leader of the revolution, meaning Lenin. So what Bekhterev knew was that Lenin was not poisoned but died from syphilis. And the death of an overly knowledgeable medical scientist became doubly beneficial to Soviet politicians. The assumption that my great-grandfather was killed is not a hypothesis but an obvious thing. He was killed for Lenin's diagnosis that Lenin had brain syphilis, according to Bekterev's great-grandson Sviatoslav Medvedev. Well, there was another explanation that was given. Death of the creator of psychic weapons. According to this hypothesis, the death of the scientist was associated in his work in the field of creating ideological weapons. So, academician Bekhterev actively worked in the field of suggestion and hypnosis. The scientist was developing a technology to inspire people with thoughts and emotions at a distance, using radio communication and a microphone and even telepathy. The ideological weapon resulting from the experiments was supposed to be directed not so much to disorganize the forces of the alleged enemy as to mobilize the Soviet masses, to set up the crowd for submissive obedience. At the beginning of 1927, one of the participants in this scientific work fled to Germany, taking with him secret documents. Bekhterev, as the project manager, found himself under the gun of the NKVD. And since psychic weapons have already been created, the services of a scientist were no longer needed, and Bekhterev was eliminated. Well, there are other explanations. We just simply don't know, but listen to this. Vladimir Bekterev's second wife was Berta Yakovlevna Area, native of Latvia. The famous medical scientist met Berta in 1916 when he was treating her first husband, a rich man from St. Petersburg, Peter Gurji, for progressive paralysis. After the revolution of 1917, Bekterev's first wife, Natalia Petrovna, remained abroad in Finland, and 30-year-old Berta Gurji became a constant companion of the 60-year-old Professor Bekhterev. After the death of Natalia Petrovna in 1926, Bekhterev officially married Berta, and she began to bear his surname, his last name. Bekterev's family, his adult children from his first marriage, were loyal to Berta while she was a friend of the scientist. But after the wedding, their attitude towards her changed. The academician's relatives were sure that his young wife was involved in the death of Vladimir Bekhterev. The great-granddaughter of the academician, Natalia Petrovna Bekhterev, spoke out. Everyone in our family knew that Vladimir Mikhailovich was poisoned by his second wife. Indeed, Berta Yakovlevna Bektereva accompanied her husband on his last trip to Moscow and was by his side in the last hours of his life, as we already described. After the death of the academician, all members of Bekterev's family were against the cremation of his body, all except Berta Yakovlevna. 10 years after the mysterious death of Bekterev's husband, her husband, Berta Yakovlevna, was arrested for espionage in favor of bourgeois Latvia and executed on December 15, 1937. Such was the turbulent history of Soviet Union's gifted scientist, and thus ended fascinating experiments pertaining to animal telepathy. But of course, I have no doubt that the research itself had to be continued somewhere else, and if not, will continue. So I wanted to thank you for your attention to my work. If you can support me, please find the links in the description to this video. Please subscribe, please tell others, and I'll bring you more fascinating story of the Russian, Ukrainian, Central Asian, and generally Eurasian paranormal. Thank you.